I saw, I think I was the last one.
All right, folks, we're going to go ahead and get started. So it is my very distinct pleasure to introduce Sarah Hayford, who is a frequent co-author and also a very good friend of mine. So I'm really pleased that I had an excuse to bring her down. So she is the director of Ohio State Institute for Population Research and professor in the Sociology department. She received her PhD in demography from one of the few demography programs that exist from the University of Pennsylvania in 2005. Did a postdoc at Duke with Phil Morgan, and then was actually a visiting scholar here in the fall of 2013. And then prior to her position at OSU, she was also at Arizona State. So Sarah is well known for her work on family formation, reproductive health, and she studies this both in the United States and internationally. In the US, her work investigates unintended fertility, fertility goals and plans, and then differentials in fertility and reproductive behaviors more broadly. She also works with the Ohio Policy Evaluation Network to look at reproductive healthcare access and policies, particularly abortion in Ohio. And internationally, she's published work on family, childbearing, and migration in Mozambique, Mexico, and Nepal. Her work has been funded by NACHD, NIA, and private foundations, and she's published in all the big journals in both demography and sociology. And so I'm really pleased to get her, have her here today to talk about her work that is not with me, so I don't know what she's doing when she's not working with me. So I'm really excited to get to hear about this other work. So please join me in welcoming Sarah.
Thank you very much, Karen. I was talking to some graduate students earlier. They didn't ask me the right question, so I didn't give them a chance to give my best piece of career advice, which is find yourself a Karen Guzzo to co-author with early on. Unfortunately, there's only one of her. So I have a title of a talk today. The actual title of this talk today is I have some cool data that I'm really excited about. It is very new data. You know, I think I'm looking at what time it's in Mozambique. Probably even as we speak, data are being collected in Mozambique. So this is going to be sort of looking back on what we know so far from this cohort study, and then talking some preliminary results of the data that we're collecting now, and then sort of longer term plans of what we're going to do in the future for this. And I want to acknowledge a whole bunch of collaborators. I've named some of the big ones. Victor Agajanian, now at UCLA, who is kind of the leader of this project in every dimension. Our collaborators in Mozambique, especially Carlos Ronaldo, Boaventura Cao, and Ina Mundo, and a lot of graduate students, including Luca Bonalato, who's at Ohio State now, and who made all of the pretty figures that I'm going to show you today. The ugly figures are all mine. So I'm going to talk today in two parts. So part one is going to be looking back. And this is going to be my highlights from the project of what I'm most interested in the work that I've done, which is mostly focusing on fertility desires and outcomes. And the kind of top line summary of this first part is that we know there are all sorts of challenges with measuring fertility desires and intentions on surveys. And I agree that they're sort of a weird construct, but also I think they're a pretty good construct. They work pretty well for a lot of the things that we want them to do. And I'm going to show you why I think based on analysis of longitudinal data. And then part two is looking forward to the next 10 years of this project. I've been they're not quite 10-year periods, but it makes a nice story that way. So part two is looking forward. We've been following a cohort of women across their reproductive years. Now they're mostly out of their reproductive years. And how are they doing? Do the experiences they had during their reproductive years connect to how they're doing now? Are women who have had more children? So how do we think about the impacts of childbearing in lives after they've come out of the period where they've had the children? And so I'm taking this isn't exactly like a conceptual framework. It's more kind of a guiding light or a motto to live by. I don't know who in this room knows this article by Susan Watkins. If all we knew about women was what we read in demography, what would we know? The graduate students still read that article. It's a great title. So Susan, this was in the 1993, the 40th anniversary issue of demography. So she went back and read everything in demography about fertility and contraception, a lot about marriage and family. She read sort of big chunks of other stuff in demography and said, how do demographers writing in demography talk about women? What do we learn about women's behaviors? How would we think about things? And one of the conclusions from this is that there's sort of a stereotype of demography as like only sort of formal demography, only caring about population aggregates, only caring about projections. And Susan pointed out that throughout demography, people have always been interested in understanding and explaining behavior. They don't just want to describe population rates, they want to know why people have children. That's always been a goal. And that's why demographers talk about women, because if you were just doing formal rates, you could just have populations and single sex age structures, and you wouldn't have to talk about women and men. And so the conclusion of this article is that we know a great deal about a limited range of women's activities and characteristics. Demographers write a lot about women aged 15 to 49. They don't write nearly as much about women outside of those reproductive years. Demographers write a lot about how women have children, which women have children, when women have children. The kind of underlying assumption is that children are one of the more important things that women do. A lot of what was written in demography up until that point, and I think it's an interesting question, is how much is demography different between 1993 and 2023 than it was between 1963 and 1993. But a lot of what was written up until then sort of thought about women or assumed that women were autonomous actors. Maybe there was some stuff about couple dynamics, but there wasn't a lot about neighbors, there wasn't a lot about friends, there wasn't a lot about mothers-in-law who were very important figures in the context they're working in Mozambique. So women are considered in isolation. And there's a lot about women, there's not much about gender. There's not much about what it means to be a woman and what it means to be a man and sort of the social systems that construct differences between women and men. So keeping this in mind, I'm going to try to talk about our data collection and the ways in which we're kind of falling into these same traps and the ways in which hopefully we're not doing all of these same things. The ways in which we're trying to consider a bigger picture of women's lives and what it means to be a woman in this particular context. So I'm talking about data collected in Mozambique. I was very excited to get to use this pointer on the point to Mozambique. So Mozambique is in southern Africa. It's on the Indian Ocean. It's just bordering South Africa, a former Portuguese colony. Like many former Portuguese colonies, there was a long and very violent transition out of being a colony and into being an independent nation, followed by a long civil war, which ended in sort of the 1990s, and there was very rapid economic growth after the end of the Civil War, but from a very sort of disrupted and chaotic baseline. So Mozambique is still one of the poorest countries in the world. Our data come from Gaza province in southern Mozambique. So Gaza borders South Africa here. Their data are collected in 4 districts in Gaza, mostly rural areas. This is predominantly a single ethnic, mostly Shangana ethnicity, mostly Christian, although a lot of different denominations. Birth rates in Gaza are pretty high. At the last DHS, the TFR was just over 5 children per woman, and ideal family size is pretty close to that. So people want a lot of kids, and people have a lot of kids. Mozambique's in the kind of southern and eastern Africa high HIV prevalence belt, and Gaza has the highest HIV prevalence levels of any province of Mozambique. Testing and treatment services were introduced like in the first decade of the 21st century. Mozambique's a PEPFAR country, so they were introduced pretty intensively. And once they became available, they were pretty widely available free of charge. What else? Oh, so it's, most people live by subsistence agriculture, rain-fed agriculture. The rain has always been variable and unpredictable, and it's become more variable and less predictable. So cycles of drought and floods. I keep reading Mozambique is one of the most highly impacted countries by climate change. I don't know exactly what that means and if that's like a real measure or if people say to scare you, but it's certainly a place where rainfall is very important to people. And partly because of this unpredictability of agricultural outputs, partly because of colonial history, power dynamics, there are high levels of out-migration, mostly to South Africa. This is mostly men who go, families stay behind, or maybe women would go for a month to join their husband, but mostly families stay in Gaza. Men go to South Africa. They used to go to work in the mines, which is very regulated, institutionalized. It was very predictable, the salaries that men earned, and their salaries were actually sent home, like they weren't given to the men. Now men are it's much more an informal labor market that men are working in South Africa, so it's much less predictable, and there's much more variation in what gets involved. So the outcomes of migration are unpredictable, both in terms of the economic returns and in terms of they're more dependent on family relationships, family dynamics, and men's commitment to their families who stay in Gaza. So basically, this is a place, that's very sort of economically precarious and on the edge, but also where there's more inequality and less predictability in economic outcomes. And so what this project is interested in sort of like the very biggest picture, is trying to understand in this setting where family systems are changing, where migration systems are changing, where economic outcomes are changing, how do women make decisions about having children and about marriage and about their husbands, about their families, where there's more variability of outcomes and less predictability. So the project is named the Men's Migration and Women's Lives Project. Its first goal, initiated by Victor in 2006, was to look specifically at men's migration and the outcomes of their families who didn't migrate. It's a longitudinal survey, population-based. There's also a set of qualitative interviews, which are also longitudinal, which I'm not talking about at all today, but if people are interested, they can email me later. So the first wave of data collection was in 2006. The sample frame was married women of reproductive age. So following the Watkins article, we're interested in women who are sort of at risk of these reproductive events. Women were sampled in 56 villages. They were stratified by husband's migration status. And then they were followed sort of at 2 to 5 year intervals, depending on funding cycles and availability after 2006. So I have attrition data up until wave 5, which was collected in 2017. We have wave 6 in the field now. By 2017, there are actually quite high levels of mortality. So over 10% of the initial wave 6 samples had died by wave 5. A lot of that is HIV mortality, although not all of it. And that HIV mortality is very much concentrated in the earliest waves of data collection before testing and treatment were available. HIV mortality is much lower now than it was. Of the surviving sample by wave 5, 82% were retained in the sample. And we do proxy interviews for people we can't find. So we know that a lot of the people who aren't retained, it's either because women have gone to visit migrant husbands in South Africa, or it's because women have separated from their husbands and gone back to their home villages. And we can track some of these women. We've actually started in recent years with cell phones to do some interviews of people in South Africa. So we're not missing all mobility in the sample, but we're disproportionately missing the women with the least stable lives. And I want to acknowledge all our funding. As Karen said, we are now aging researchers as of the last wave of data collection. And I should have said also, if people have questions, feel free to stop me throughout. I'm happy to take questions whenever. So this is like the, in broad strokes, what the project looks like. So we have 5 waves of data collection completed and a sort of very short COVID wave by telephone, so subsample in 2021 and 22. Wave 6 is ongoing. The early waves of the survey were very much focused on marriage and fertility history, women's economic activities, fertility intentions, contraceptive use. Starting in 2009 and 2011, this was HIV money, so there was a lot of context around HIV testing and treatment, availability, access, attitudes, utilization. We have some data also collected in clinics at that point, some sort of institutional data on how clinics were organized. I'm talking about this because this is also a sales pitch for the data, right? The data are all publicly available. I want you all to start using these. We also started, sort of as the children start getting older in these middle waves, we started asking more questions about children. So where are the children home? They left home. Why are they married or are they in school? Question about children's education, some questions about investment in children's health, vaccination record, metric measures in some of these early waves. And especially in waves 4 and 5, and very much in this current wave that's ongoing, many more detailed questions about where they leave the house. Where do they go and why? Children's transition to adulthood. In wave 5, we started collecting more questions about physical health, women's mental health, subjective well-being, and also some questions about women's relationships with their children. So not just where the children are, but like, are women in touch with their children? Do children come to visit? Do they talk on the phones, or what are those relationships like? And are women helping their children? Are children helping their mothers? What are the exchange relationships like between mothers and children? As well as exchange relationships with other people. So are women also lending money to their neighbors? Are they getting help from their siblings, church members? So a sort of fuller picture of how women are connected to their community, how women are sort of dependent on their community members and also supporting their community members. One more thing to point out, you may notice that sample sizes increase over these early years. That's because of how we did sample refreshment. So we sort of tried to follow up everybody, and we also did sample refreshment. So we sort of got a little bit bigger in those early ways and then started getting smaller in later ways with attrition. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about wave 6, which is in the field now. We have about 1,600 women so far, and we're hoping for a few hundred more. A lot of focus, as I said, on children's life course experiences, a much broader set of health measures, including, objective measures of health conditions, as well as subjective health, and expanded measures of support exchanges between women and their children, as well as women and community members. And we have another wave planned for 2025. I think that's it. Questions here?
What is sample refreshment?
Oh, so sample refreshment, so like at wave 2, so like the interviewers would go out to the villages, they might find a woman or they might not find a woman. If they couldn't find a woman, they were instructed to go find someone else, like, find the next house to that woman. We had a rule about how to select someone. So they interviewed another woman, but then they went back 6 months later to see if they could find the original woman. So in some cases we had like 2 women.
Cool.
Do you continue to have content about the husbands and their migration?
Yes, we ask in these 4 and 5 were short waves because we had less money there, so we had a shorter history. But I think we collect 10 years of migration history for 3 waves.
So you mentioned earlier presentation about how I guess the labor market for husbands work shifted from like a regulated to more of like an unregulated space. Well, I guess what was sort of like the time period? Like, is that transition captured in these like longitudinal waves?
I'm trying to think. No, this was mostly all informal. Like, men are not mostly working in mines. I'm trying to think. I think at some point we have some questions about like, do they have documents or they document that South Africa has changed their border rule. Yeah, this is mostly all of it. Not me. And that's also my real sales pitch. We really want someone to collect biomarkers. We don't want. So if somebody wants no, but we ask sort of like, has anybody told you have this condition? We do some measurements like we do. Anything else? So I just want to, I sort of said this at the beginning, but I'm going to say it again. This is my take on this project. This is not the overview that Victor would give about the main findings of the project. This is the things that I'm most interested in. I'm not going to talk about actually like a lot of the core interest areas of the project. Today. I'm not going to talk much about migration. So that, just wanted to make that clear. And I was a little talking about like in this talk. I think everything that I'm going to show you is either analyses that I've run or that like I think I'm looking at content. Okay, so I'm talking about fertility desires and outcomes first. Just a kind of big picture, one slide on my life's work on fertility desires and intentions. Almost as long as demographers have been collecting survey data on childbearing, they've been collecting measures of childbearing goals, of desires, intentions, ideals. And these have been used both to predict outcomes. So when people were very worried about population growth rates and birth rates or population shrinking, they thought that collecting intentions for the future would be probably going to happen. And they've been used to understand motivations. Again, demographers have always been interested in understanding why and in understanding what pushes people to have children. More recently, intentions and desires have been used as a kind of measure of reproductive autonomy or women's empowerment, with the idea being that you have to ask women what they want, and then the goal is not to have more children or fewer children, but to help women meet their goals, which they themselves identify as their goals. So that's sort of an additional reason to be asking women about their goals. And I mean, so pretty much for as long as demographers have been measuring fertility goals, there's been a strong recognition of the limitations of these measures. Norman Ryder writes really interestingly about this in sort of the middle of the 20th century, about all the things that are wrong with these survey measures of intentions and desires. They actually work reasonably well as predictors. They predict behavior like better than anything else that demographers look at, but they're not at all perfect measures of future behavior. And so there's been interest in, is this a measurement problem? Like if there's something we can do on surveys to better measure future behaviors, it's just inherently problematic and hard to predict. And the other thing is that we know, anybody who has talked to a person about their fertility goals knows that people have mixed feelings about having children. People's feelings about having children change. People's goals may be uncertain or they may be contingent on other life outcomes. And these aren't very well captured by a yes/no survey question. Now, you can also ask survey questions that aren't yes/no. You can ask lots of better measures. Increasingly, people are measuring these things by scales. People are asking explicitly about uncertainty and don't know, and I'm not sure responses. But there is, I would say there are some people who think it's hopeless to try to measure fertility goals on surveys. I am not one of those people. And I think my reading is maybe in the past 10 or 15 years in the demographic literature, Eileen is probably the person who knows this best, but my perception is in the past 10 or 15 years, there's been more attention to the limitations of these measures and less attention to the strengths of these measures. So I want to talk a little bit about sort of how longitudinal data helps us understand both the limitations and the strengths of these measures. So the question that we use in this in our survey is, would you like to have more children in the future, even if not right now? This is pretty close to a standard like DHS question. This even if not right now is an addition sort of trying to make people think about like really what do you ever want in your life, which, who knows how well that worked. And we do have an explicit don't know response, although not very many people give that response. And so just to give you a sense of like, what does a reproductive career look like in this setting? These are some basic descriptive measures across 6 ways of data collection. This is, not the full 6 ways yet, but this is what we have as of yesterday. So age, number of live births, number of living children, proportion who want to stop childbearing at each survey wave. And so, as you expect over time, people get older. So we have average age 27 in the first wave, average age 45 in the last wave. We can talk a little bit about the age ranges and the age misreporting if you want. And as you would expect, people have more children over time. So they had about 3 children on average at the beginning, 5.6 children on average at the end. And you can also see that, like, kind of as you would expect, they have children faster in the earlier waves than in the later waves. That as they get older, they have children more slowly. More women have reached their fertility goals. They may have more sort of problems conceiving. At every wave, the number of living children is less than the number of live births. So infant and child mortality is high in this setting. The average number of child deaths in the sample was like 0.8. So a lot of women have experienced child death. And sort of nicely for demographers, the proportion of women who want to stop childbearing increases linearly. About a quarter of women at the first wave, almost 90%, more than 90% of women at the last wave. Now, if you look at individual trajectories and fertility desires, they're much less nice and linear. People go back and forth. They want to stop at one wave, and they want more. They have more children, but they don't have more children. So there's a lot of variation in the individual trajectory, but you have this nice aggregate trajectory. And we did start asking in the last 2 waves, we started asking about what people's perception of their own fecundity was. So we asked, like, if you want to have a child, do you think you could? At wave 5 in 2017, I think it was like 97% said, yes, I think I could have a child if I wanted to. At wave 6, about 40% of women said, yes, I could have a child if I wanted to. So there's sort of lots of dimensions on which their reproductive careers are competing with men. They're having fewer children, they're wanting fewer children, and they're less confident that they could have a child if they want. So certainly, this is the average age of the sample. There's a range. There's some women who are still having children at 6, but most women have sort of moved out of the most intensive phase of childbirth. I'm looking to see if there's anything else I wanted to say about that, but I don't think so. So I said the kind of top line finding for me, from looking at these longitudinal data, is that survey measures of fertility desires are meaningful and they're predictive. They might not necessarily mean what demographers want them to mean, but they're understandable. They describe reality in some ways. Most of this comes from a couple of articles that Victor and I wrote together. At the most basic level, the desire to have another child predicts future childbearing. It's a little hard to get like one number to summarize how strong that relationship is. And it actually varies over time. But about the proportion of women who have another child is about 10% higher between ways among women who want another child than among women who don't want another child. So again, not a perfect predictor, but like a strong predictor. It tells us a lot about it. And it's a stronger predictor for some women than for others. And we can understand why it's a stronger predictor. So for example, women who live in wealthier households are more likely to carry out desires of having children. Women whose husbands are migrants, and especially women whose husbands are migrants, not very successful migrants who don't send money back, are much more likely to carry out desires to stop childbearing. Women who live in communities with high HIV mortality are more likely to carry out. And I think that's partly about access and also partly about kind of the strength of that motivation. If there are other factors, your relationship, your community, your surroundings, sort of supporting you in that desire to stop, or are there? And we can also predict who says they want to stop having. It's closely related to parity, as you might expect. People who have more children are more likely to but also independent of parents. Older women are more likely to say they want to stop having children. Women in poor health are more likely to say they want to stop having children. Women in households that are more economically challenged are more likely to say they want to stop. And as those conditions change, women's desires also change. So women's desires are responsive to the situation they find themselves in. Which is not what you would expect from a sort of very classical demographic understanding of fertility, where fertility desires are only driven by parity. But fertility desires are responsive to social context.
Yes, question. Are you finding over time that the correlation between the desires and what they do is higher? I'm just thinking with increased, well, in the 2006 sample, they might have been using condoms more because of HIV, and less likely to use, more effective methods, and access improved. If you've seen any of that.
I was actually thinking about that.
By age and all the other stuff going on too.
Yeah, I was thinking about that as I was putting this talk together, and I was like, oh, we should actually look at that. I looked at the correspondence between desires and contraceptive use, and that didn't seem to change over time, at least in the first 3 days. I haven't gone back since the first 3 days. I haven't looked at variation in between desires and outcomes, and just the crosstabs, it does vary pretty substantially, but I have. But I think also, that's sort of, it's about access to contraception, about the access to HIV care, and also sort of the conflict. There are lots of things pressuring women as they get older to stop having children. So it's sort of less hard to carry out desires. Other questions?
Have you considered, or do you think it's relevant that the desires for future fertility is influenced by experience with child mortality that they know about either their own or close relatives say?
Yeah, we've never looked at that with these data. We've looked at community HIV mortality, which is a different kind of mechanism than child mortality. I know, and now I'm not remembering what's the Milwaukee longitudinal project is looking at the younger women, but they've looked at a lot more at child mortality outcomes.
You talked about kind of like how the men have a role in determining whether or not women carry their fertility desires. What's the context like in terms of values? I'm sure questions like DHS and World Value Survey about men's control over the family and stuff like that.
Yeah, so we asked questions about women's decision making and women's mobility, the sort of standard, not exactly the DHS questions, but if you wanted to take the kid to the doctor, could you do that, or would you have to ask permission? And there's variation on that in the sample. I sort of mentioned in passing mothers-in-law are a big influence, so especially for migrant men, like mothers-in-law are the ones who are perceived as having a lot of decision-making power in the household. Actually, it's really interesting that some of the data that we collected from clinics, the nurses blame all the bad outcomes on the mothers-in-law. Like the mothers-in-law are the most conservative forces. And, you know, nurses have their own perspectives. So certainly, like, at least in theory, men have a lot of control, but also, especially if men are away, they don't actually have a lot of, you know, they're not there. So the question of who has control over those decisions is a complicated question. That's a bad answer, but.
Oh, I thought the table you showed about, you know, do you want to stop fertility at later ways is really interesting. And then too, how you brought up like the differing kind of response to whether people think they can have children. So I know like here in the US, like 30, once you kind of hit the age of 35, you're like having a geriatric pregnancy, and you know, there's all this talk about like the risks that are associated with that. Like what's the narrative around like having children at older ages in Mozambique, or is there not really a different narrative if you're having a baby at 26 versus 30?
Yeah, no, I mean, certainly people, like, childbearing is risky and people perceive that risk as increasing over time. And there are also social rules around, like, you know, when your oldest kid gets married, like, then it's like not that cool to be having children anymore. So there's certainly like social pressures, you know, social norms around the appropriate age for children.
I guess in addition to sort of like values, expectations, and like health outcomes, I was wondering if you captured any sort of aspect of like intimate partner violence in data set.
We ask, I mean, you know, I don't know. Certainly there are limitations to survey measures, but we ask about intimate partner violence. We ask about forced sex. In the most recent wave that we're collecting now, like we ask some questions like, does your husband yell at you or belittle you? So we have a slightly wider set of, you know, sort of not just physical violence. And in the early waves, we ask some questions about trust too, especially in those HIV intensive ways. We ask about, like, do you think your husband has other partners? So my main conclusion is that survey measures of fertility desires can tell us a lot about the world and about behavior. And it's important to pay attention to the fact that survey measures of fertility desires don't map onto the kind of classic demographic way of thinking about fertility desires. So this kind of stopping and spacing are the like big measures of fertility transition. The idea is if you don't want to have a child, it's either because you don't want any more ever, or because you have a fixed time at which you want to have the next birth. Those two constructs are very distinct. Women know which pool they're in. Once you hit this sort of stopping measure, you want to stop forever, and you know that desire is stable, and it's about how many children you want to have. So those are the classic demographic constructs. If you look longitudinally, it's pretty clear that's not the way that women are responding to these survey questions. So it's very clear that people change their minds about wanting to stop, not just in response to the number of children they have, but in response to their individual characteristics. You know, when their household experiences an economic shock, they're more likely to say they want to stop. When their household is doing well economically, they're more likely to say they want more. It's also pretty clear that the kind of stopping and spacing boundary is pretty fuzzy, that it seems like for the way that people are responding to these questions is they know pretty clearly whether they want to have a child now or not. And they don't have a good sense of like, in 3 years, am I going to want another kid? Maybe I will, maybe I won't, but I know I don't want to have a kid now. And so that they go back and forth between like, I never want to have a kid, maybe I want to have a kid in 5 years. Like you can see the sort of transition between these survey responses across survey waves. But also these processes can be described and understood using survey data. It's not as though these are totally independent forces that are sort of just, that are, you know, inscrutable. If we ask questions, if we analyze the data in context, if we think about the situations people are in and how they're responding to these questions, we can understand their responses. So yes, we could do a better job of asking survey questions that match better the way that people are making these decisions and match better to the social context. But even with the questions we have, we can do a pretty good job of understanding how decision making is working, and sort of how decision making is responsive to context. So that's my part one. And so then the part two is in some ways the so what of this. Like the premise, the front section of all these articles that I've written is always like having children is consequential for women's lives, it's consequential for women's health. We should care about it. And so we're now at the stage when we can look at these questions. How is childbearing connected to women's well-being in midlife, broadly construed well-being, physical health, mental health, economic conditions, social conditions? So we have a lot of measures of well-being in these different domains in our more recent ways of data collection. These are 4 that can be put nicely in a table and summarized nicely in a single measure. We have a measure of self-rated health on a 4-point scale, a measure of life satisfaction that's like overall, how satisfied are you with how your life is going, also on a 4-point scale. A subjective measure of economic well-being, so do you think your household is better off or worse off than other households in your communities? And a more objective measure of sort of the sufficiency of household resources, a scale measuring household food security. So it's a little hard for me to tell like what counts as a good score on a 4-point scale of life satisfaction. But I would say like women in our sample on average are doing pretty okay. You know, on a 4-point scale of self-rated health, the average score is 2.9. On a 4-point scale of life satisfaction, the average score is 3.1. Everybody's not like delighted, but they're doing pretty well. 18% of the sample says their household is better off than, I don't know what you would expect. Like, would you expect them to top 50% that they're better off? But, you know, there's some variation in how people perceive how they're doing in those particular communities. Really good. So people are doing okay. There's a lot of variation. We want to understand how this variation, you know, understand this variation and especially how it's connected to reproduction. So the first kind of most basic question, the coefficient from an OLS regression, number of children predicting life satisfaction on a 4-point scale. I was telling Emma, I always just run these things OLS. It looks the same if you run it Poisson, but it's easier to interpret OLS. This is at wave 5. And you can see there's basically no association between the number of children and life satisfaction. Controlling for some stuff, this is pretty robust to other controls. The number of children you have, you don't seem to be doing better or doing worse. But if you think about why having children might be associated with life satisfaction, you start thinking about like, okay, well, children are a lot of work, children are very demanding, but maybe children also help support you in your old age. Different children fall differently into those characteristics, right? So you would expect young children are more demanding, older children are more likely to sort of be supportive. Maybe, you know, certain children's experiences are related to whether they're providing support for their parents or whether they're doing those support for their parents. So if you separate this out by children's age and by where children are, so these are also coefficients from an OLS regression predicting life satisfaction. But this is separating out the number of children age 0 to 6, so the sort of younger preschool children who are the most demanding of parental time and care. School-age children age 6 to 14, adolescent and young adult children age 15 and up in the household, living out of the household in Mozambique and living outside of Mozambique. So what you can see here is sort of what you would expect, right? Young children are bad. The farther children are better. I used to have a heading on this slide of like, are children actually any good? And these associations are small. So this is coefficients on a 4-point scale. None of them are huge. So this is not like the most predictive thing of women's well-being in midlife. Actually, there's very strong predictive value of marital status and especially husband's migration status. Women with successfully migrant husbands have the highest life satisfaction. Right. And this association is sort of partially mediated by economic conditions in the household, but not fully mediated. And this is, so these kids are still pretty young. If they're in South Africa working, they're not earning like a ton of money. So they're not like a huge economic contribution to the household, but maybe they're making some economic contribution, and maybe they have a sort of promise of future economic contribution. This association is not mediated by household.
How common is it for age 15 to 18 to live in the household versus move away?
It's not normative to move out, like just to move out. And one of the things that's going on here is that these kids age 15 and older who are out of the household in Mozambique are mostly daughters who have married and left the household. And these kids who are 15 and older out of Mozambique are mostly sons. So there's like a kind of a gender story going on there too. Sons, especially oldest sons, will often stay in the household when they get married or stay very near the household.
What was the average age of the women during wave 5?
Like 39, I think. Yeah. And I think this is also one of the things, a lot of the literature on life satisfaction and childbearing outcomes is from high income countries where you either have young children or you have old children. In this case, where people have a lot of kids, and especially in sub-Saharan Africa, birth intervals are long. A lot of people have both young children and children. So you have to sort of think about the combination of these different children. So this is like an interesting cross-sectional descriptive pattern. One of the things we're really interested in doing with wave 6 is getting at some change over time. So we asked the same question about life satisfaction. And so you can see sort of the fixed effects thing of if a kid moves out of the household, how does that change life satisfaction? The other thing that we have in wave 6 is much more detailed measures of exchange with children. So I'm going to show you some like sort of very basic descriptive pictures of exchange with children and talk a little bit about our plans for this. And I'm very interested to hear about your suggestions for what else we might do. So this is a descriptive picture of exchange with children, help that women give to their children and help they get from their children. So we have financial help at the top, material exchange, goods, food, instrumental exchange, helping with agriculture, with household tasks, and some caregiving questions at the bottom. And these are paired so that we have giving financial help to children and getting financial help from children, giving goods, receiving goods. The caregiving are a little harder to pair, so giving help with grandchildren, there's not a like natural reciprocal exchange there. The blue bars are women who say, yes, I engage in this form of exchange. The red bars are women who say no. And this is aggregated across all children. We also have child-specific measures, but I'm just showing you the aggregation here. So you can see there's a lot of exchange. There's a lot of exchange in different domains. In some domains, this is pretty close to reciprocal. So like if you look at financial help, women are slightly more likely to have gotten financial help than to have given financial help, but it's pretty close to even. And so one of our questions is obviously, is this that women are giving help to some kids and getting help from other kids? Or is it that when women are having a hard month, they're getting help, when they're having a good month, they're getting help? It's a sort of distribution over time or across dyads. And you can see there are other domains of exchange where it's much less reciprocal. So if you look at giving help with agriculture, women are much more likely to say they got help with agriculture than that they gave agriculture. And that's partly because at this part of life course, they're the ones who have the fields. So the kids will come help them in their fields. The kids don't have fields of their own yet. The women could help them. Similarly, women are much more likely to get help with household tasks than to give help. So we have a lot of questions about, just about sort of understanding who's giving what and when, and also thinking about the consequences of these. So you might think that receiving financial help is always helpful, but maybe it's not the people who are worse off are the ones who are getting financial help. Or maybe there's sort of a satisfaction of being able to help other people, and there's a sense of shame in receiving help. So sort of understanding the different ways that these exchange relationships might impact well-being, and do they impact subjective well-being differently than economic measures or health. And we also have some questions not just about these sort of material exchanges, but about emotional and affective dimensions of women's relationships with their children. So this top box is some sort of standard social support questions. Again, going in both directions. Do women listen when the child wants to talk or express feelings? Does the child listen to them? Do they give children useful information? Do they get useful information from their children? This is the mother's definition of what's useful, so there's some subjectivity in there. And this is at the dyad level, so this is a specific child, not aggregated across all children. And you can see, you know, this goes from always to never. How often do you do those things? And women are saying pretty often, you know, most of the time, I'm listening to my child is listening to me. But there is some variation on this end of the sort of rarely, so sort of understanding, is this just the fact that, you know, because some children are around and some children aren't around? Or are there some children who are sort of more engaged in these kind of emotional exchanges? And then we ask both about positive emotional connections with children, how much do women love their children, how much do their children love them? You can think about, again, like, how do we read survey questions on these? Most people say they love their children. But also we ask women, how much do they worry about their children? And we have very high levels of saying women who say they worry a lot about their children. And is that because of things that their children are doing? Is that because of, you know, the mother's conditions where they're more worried? And how does that worry maybe affect women's well-being? You know, is that related to sort of perceptions of economic support, or is it more about concerns for children's health? So we're very interested in understanding these dimensions of women's relationships with their children as well.
Sarah, you said this was specific to a dyad. Did you ask about a random child, or did you ask about each child?
We asked about each child.
And then, but it's not an average, you said.
This is averaged across all dyads. And so I think technically we should weight it by number of children or something like that. But that's it. Yeah. And so, yes, so in theory, we can tell, like, are you most worried about the child that you give money to?
Well, yeah, and I'd also like to see it by like age. Are you more worried about your younger children or your older children, you know, and sort of some of those other relationships to living at home and not living at home?
Yeah, exactly. Is living at home more worrisome or less worrisome? Yeah. So the sort of like big picture recap, you know, what we talked about fertility preferences, they're pretty predictive, but not perfectly predictive. By their mid-40s, women have mostly finished having children. That there's some suggestion that their reproductive experiences are associated with well-being and midlife. It's clear that women are engaged in sort of lots of different kinds of exchange relationships with their children. And the next step for us is really kind of understanding the relationship between those things. So we have some plans, and we're also very open to ideas and suggestions, especially the early ways of data are all publicly available now. The later ways of data will be publicly available. And we would be very excited about working with other people to collect additional data around biomarkers, cognitive decline, now that we're aging researchers, around climate and environmental impacts. Victor and some collaborators have done some work, like linking the rainfall data to some bits here, but there's a lot more that could be done in those dimensions. And thinking about child development, so sort of connecting some of our early measures of investment in children with later outcomes for children. So please be in touch if you have ideas about any of those things. And I will end there, and I'm happy to take any more questions.
Sarah, that was great.
I wanted to follow up on your comments about marital status, migration status, and what was it, sense of well-being or whatever, and how that works with kids. And I guess my question is, to what extent does having children of particular ages, sexes, numbers affect those things? You controlled for them, but I wondered if they mediated at all the effects of children. Like
does children affect whether the husband migrates or not?
Yeah, and then is the husband happy? Is marital? Are they more likely to stay together if there are children? Are they, you know, all those kinds of things?
Yeah, I'm trying to think. So migration is certainly related to separation, and it seems that, you know, husbands who leave and don't send money, that's sort of like maybe a first step towards marital separation. And we've looked at migration predicting fertility desires and outcomes. I don't think we've ever looked at the reverse. like, you know, men might either migrate like to pay for kids' schooling or, you know, because they're sick of all the kids in the household or, yeah, no, there's, I don't think we've ever looked at that. And this is, migration is quite common and quite easy, so it's not highly selective. So our, you know, what we always tell reviewers is like, you know, everybody migrates at some point or another, and we're not worrying about it, but that's probably not really true, and we should look more carefully at the predictors of migration.
I do research in the menopause. And as your population is getting older, have you considered in wave 7, like talking about like upcoming menopause or like how perimenopause is impacting their well-being? I don't know how, like, if it's very stigmatized in Mozambique or not. Just like kind of considering that like end of reproductive like aspect and how that's going to impact their well-being.
Yeah, you know, I would love to have some suggestions. Like, is there a, you know, will we have to ask like 20 questions? Could we ask a few questions? Like, are there a few key things that we should be thinking about?
But
yeah,
I think it would be kind of interesting just because I don't know like the atmosphere around menopause. So I don't know, like, is it common knowledge? Is everybody expecting it?
Yeah.
If it's very impactful or not.
And I would say like that's sort of my ignorance coming, like spending a lot of time with this stage of the reproductive life course and like understanding, you know, what a clinic visit looks like for family planning and like having no idea of what.
And it might be totally like left field for what you're doing and you're like, how would I even bring this up? Why would I bring this up? But
yeah, no, I mean, it's obviously like an important part of the aging process. And so sort of understanding.
The Swan study at UCLA, you know, studied menopause transitions really extensively, and I'm sure they have good sets of questions that you could get at. But I don't think there's much from poorer countries. We thought about this for our work as well about those transitions and how similar or different women experience them relative to what people in studies.
I mean, I don't think the data anywhere is that great. So.
Talk a little bit about the religious context of Gaza, and you mentioned a little bit about it's largely Christian, but a bunch of denominations and how that may or may not be changing and influencing both the fertility and the well-being of women in this context. And then just a little child-free women has to be very small given the TFR, but is there, do you have any estimate there?
Yeah, I'll talk about fertility and I'll say Victor is the person to, or so I'll talk about religion. Victor's really the person to talk to about religion. He knows much more about religion, is much more interested and spent much more time sort of thinking about religion in this context. So it's mostly Christian. What there is there's sort of like different waves of Christian churches, you know, so there's like the colonial mission churches and then the sort of like Africanized churches and then some newer churches that are more sort of Zionist, like sort of do more faith healing, sort of, I want to say more expressive. I don't think that's like the word that a religion scholar would use to describe that. Pentecostal, maybe, yeah. I mean, so one of the interesting things is around HIV and around churches with faith healing traditions and sort of how do people navigate church membership and church connections in a setting where there's a lot of threats to health and not a lot of institutionalized solutions. The other thing that churches are really important is as a source of like sort of mutual aid and of sort of connections to women outside of the family and household sphere of sort of community connections. So it's not like there's not so much churches that are like anti-contraception or anti-birth control, but there are churches that are more or less supportive of sort of we might say calculus of conscious choice of sort of managing family formation and managing family building. So the sort of congregational context certainly has an impact on contraceptive use and fertility, and Victor's written about that. And churches are also, in some senses, like sources, like churches do a lot of things, like you do a lot of community and mutual aid, and women can have like power in those things, like women can be in charge of things. So they're also a source of sort of like a way for women to have status and have control that you might think would be related to family formation and couple relationships as well. So that's not been a focus of the stuff that I've done, but there's a lot of work that could be done with these data. And then in terms of women without children, I mean, you use the word child-free. I don't think there's any child-free women in this sample. There are certainly women who have experienced a lot of child death and have experienced a lot of miscarriages and stillbirth. And so there's a few, it's less than 5% of the sample at weight 5 had no children. And you can, like, you know, we ask about full fertility histories. Clearly miscarriages are underreported, but you can see people who have had 4 pregnancies and no live birth. Certainly that's a challenge. And I did those measures of well-being. I did it separating any children and no children. The women with no children are so different. So such a small group that you don't really feel there. We did ask in the most recent wave of data collection, we asked about children. We asked about your children and your pregnancy history. And then we also asked about, are there any children who are like your own children to them? Which we weren't really sure what we would get out of that question, but lots of people say like, oh yes, you know, like I raised the cousin's child, or I raised the neighbor's child, or my husband's children from his previous wife, you know, are like children. So, you know, there are sort of other ways to have maternal relationships, even for women who have children.
I was wondering if you knew, like whether there's a relationship between like how many children a household has and like whether or not they receive help from the farm.
Like on in their own farming. We could know that. We don't know that. Farming, like, so most of the agricultural work in this context is women's work. So it would mostly be daughters and maybe younger sons who are helping, but like sort of once sons become grown-ups, they don't help with agricultural tasks. It's sort of the day-to-day agricultural work.
Yeah, nobody else has their hand up. I've got one more for you. I wanted to hear more about the in-laws and the mother-in-law in particular, I guess, and what you know about her and what the relationship is with the mother, and you know, is well-being positively affected by them or negatively, and what happens when they die?
Yes, and I will say, like, what I really want to know is, like, you know, the first wave of the sample, the mothers-in-law were like the oppressive force in these women's lives, and now these women are mothers-in-law, and sort of what does that transition look like? You know, sort of how is the sort of generational shift of power in the household? So I will tell you what we know. We know whether there's a mother-in-law in the household or not at each wave. So we could know if a mother-in-law dies between waves, but we don't ask explicitly about the timing of the mother-in-law's death, which would have been a good thing to ask. And we don't have anything directly about a woman's relationship with her mother-in-law. So we ask about, like, who do you talk to? You know, so we ask about kids and we ask about husbands, and then we say, of all the other people around you, who do you talk to? Who do you tell about your problems? Who do you go to when you just want to have a good time? Who do you ask for help? And so we can see whether they name mothers-in-law in those questions or not, but we don't directly ask, like, your specific mother-in-law, you know, how do you feel about her? So it's sort of more, I would say the information about mothers-in-law comes from sort of the context more from the direct survey measures. And I'm trying to think, even in the qualitative interviews, again, we ask about relationships within that household. We don't ask specifically about mothers-in-law. So some, you know, presumably some of that comes up, but we don't have a systematic sort of sense of variation in the relationship.
Oh, I have a question following up with that. So you mentioned that oldest sons often stay in the household. So would, like, the wives of then older, like, what about younger sons and their families? Like, do they kind of go out and make their own household, or do they kind of do younger sons as well, like, stay within the household?
They often stay within the household. It's a patrilocal marriage system, meaning that women, when they get married, move to live with their husband, and sort of often with their husband's family, like either in the same household or in the same compound or in the same village. But sons tend to live closer to their mothers than daughters do once they leave the house.
I'm thinking of the mother-in-laws. I was just wondering, like, would it make a difference, like, if you're married to the oldest son versus like the third or fourth son in terms of like involvement in the mother-in-law and your lives and stuff?
Yes, and the other thing about, you know, so we show that having a kid in South Africa is good for well-being. we know but haven't analyzed, like, does that son have a wife in the household? And like, maybe that's the best case scenario of you have a daughter-in-law to take care of you and a son who's away that you're not working.
And then, sorry, and then with children, do you see like sex differences at all?
It's not a context with strong sex preferences, which is also, you know, like people have a lot of kids. So like, if you have a lot of kids, you mostly have sons.
All right, we're out of time, so thank you so much for